Exclamation, everybody, and welcome back to some code review as I look at the Open Vehicular Epic game. When we last left off, I had talked a whole lot about random stuff, general reasonings for doing certain things. We also looked at saving the game options and all that stuff and testing around it. And I said, let's come back and take a look now at the keyboard input stuff. So I haven't implemented, as you can see, the event handler yet for the keyboard input. And more importantly, I haven't kind of tied it into how we're going to actually look at it from the rest of the game perspective, because the challenge here is I want to, obviously I need to handle keyboard input coming in, but I don't want the rest of the system to have to care. I'm trying to come up with as generic as I can implementation, or maybe generic's the wrong word, as abstract an implementation as I can, where the rest of the system just needs to know, hey, an event happened that I have to deal with. And I know exactly what event happened, and I don't care how it happened, just that it happened. So I don't care that I don't necessarily care that it was the user typing something on the keyboard as opposed to pressing a button on a controller or on a mouse, per se. I just care that the event happened. That's going to be the tricky part, because obviously there's context involved in trying to figure out, what context did this happen in? So, because obviously, if you're in a menu and you click on something, that's different than if you're driving the car and you click and that fires your guns or something like that. So this is where I haven't quite fleshed out in my brain yet exactly how we're going to do the mapping. I know I need to do some sort of mapping, but I also need context clues as to how to do the mapping properly. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to pull in status. And you remember very long time ago, in the VE class here, there is a enumeration that I left in here called status because it made sense to keep it here. And the status is telling us basically where are we at in the game. Are we in the options menu? Are we in the main menu? Are we in the vehicle viewer? Are we in the vehicle select? Are we driving? Are we playing? Are we in the playing version of the game where we're actually driving the car and stuff? This is where we're going to have to get our context from. This is where we're going to have to know, okay, based on our current status, this is what this keyboard command now means. Or this keyboard command is even valid at this point, which is probably even more important than whether or not what it means. So given that, I'm probably going to take the status enum and move it to its own class. You don't have to, because as you can see, it's public here, so I could still refer to it. I could just refer to it as ve.status. So it doesn't necessarily have to live in fact, it's even referred to that way here. It doesn't necessarily have to live in its own class. But for the sake of, being able to easily find it, I'm going to move it, and I'm going to actually rename it as well, which is also kind of hicky, it's a little hinchy. It's like I don't necessarily need to rename it. Status is actually pretty good name, but I kind of want to, if I'm going to move it out of here, then I feel like I need to call it, say, game status, for instance. And I also think perhaps we may need additional statusi in here, but we'll see. I suspect what's here is good enough. but there might be a situation where we need something a little bit more. So the question is, where does this live? And the only place I can think to put it is literally in the main in the main package, because I think that's sufficiently illustrative of the fact that this is something that is going to be used by a lot of different things. And so by putting it up in the top level package along with, VE and stuff, you kind of signify to the developers that this is important and this is prominent and it's used by a lot of different things. Just by, you kind of imply that it's used by a lot of different things even without, necessarily having to say it per se. So let's take this status and let's go and make a enumeration over here, and we'll call it game state. We'll call it, because it is really a state machine, which is a whole other concept in and of itself. If you've ever done any kind of AI development or anything, state machines are pretty prominent over there. Games are at their core sort of state machines, because you're always in some sort of state. You're either playing or you're in a menu or you're in something else. You know what I mean? They're not necessarily, they're multi-threaded, but they're not, from a user perspective, there's only really one thing going on at any one time. You're either playing or you're looking at a menu or something like that's going on. From a very generic, me struggling to explain it kind of view, that's where it is. So we're going to have this sort of state machine that's going on, and it's going to be denoted by this status. And I think I copied a little too much here, but let's grab that here, and we're just going to call it bam. We're just going to throw that right in just as it was. Save, which will reformat it for me, and that's good. I'm not going to make any other real changes to that as it is. I'm just going to come into here, and I'm just going to remove it from there so that we see where everything goes in error. Okay. There's a status and a last status. This is where kind of the state machine kind of thing comes in too. We'll have to work on that a little bit to see what to do there. But what I'm gonna do is change this to, and it should give me that option. Change to game state. Does it know? Will it know? Will it find it? I don't think it does. No. No, it's too. I've changed the name too much for Eclipse to understand that what I've done. So I'm going to do Control-2 and R, and I'm going to say game state. Right, and that will then become this one as well, and then that will become this as well. There we go. Bam. All right. That was a relatively painless move, at least for what we see in front of us anyway. So now you can see also something to note. I have it set so that when I save something and it formats, it only formats the lines that I've actually changed, or at least it attempts to only format the lines I actually changed. So that's why these got indented, but the rest haven't. I do that for a reason. I do that mostly for when you commit something, you're doing like small refactorings, and you commit something to source control. It usually sucks if your formatter reformats the entire file, because then it looks like when somebody looks at differences, it looks like you changed the entire file when in fact you only changed the spacing. So it's usually good practice if you're formatting things to only format the lines that you actually change, so that when someone looks at it later on, they don't see that you change the entire file when in fact you only change like 2 lines. That's something you don't learn that's something you don't learn until you do it wrong. And then and then a veteran on the team comes to you and goes, "What the hell are you doing?" And you get yelled at and you're like, "Oh, sorry." Everybody makes that mistake. Trust me. It's one of those things where you're bound to get yelled at for it, and then you'll be more careful. It's just, it happens. And it happens actually a lot of times especially if you've moved to a new IDE, or if you installed a new version of the IDE, sometimes you forget to select that off, and you end up reformatting an entire file. And yeah, and then you're like, crap, I did this wrong. But anyway, I digress. Everybody gets yelled at for that. Trust me, you're not alone in that regard. Particularly if you get yelled at for spaces versus tabs, that's another thing too. Anywho, so we've done that. We moved that game state out there. So now comes the part where I've kind of got to look at the keyboard class here. And I got to figure out how I'm going to do this. So we have the input here. We have key events coming in. We also have the bindings that have been loaded by the options loader. Which means I need to know what things are bound where. So in order for this keyboard input event handler to even function properly, we need to take in a private properties game options, and that needs to be set in the constructor. So we'll say properties game options. Whoop, spell it properly as well. And I'll say this dot game options equals game options. Now, undoubtedly, you're looking at this and going, but wait, you're implementing an event handler and you're putting a constructor in this. Well, yeah, I mean, it's when I go to set this event handler on the scene, I'm going to have to make sure that I have options loaded and everything and all that stuff going. So, which I think is reasonable, because you want to, there has to be some order of operations enforced, right? You need some kind of information before you can do stuff. So this is basically enforcing an order of operations, making sure that before someone starts attaching your input handler to stuff, they've actually loaded up the properties and given them to you, the game properties. So we'll set the game options there. We'll be using that to determine what keys map to what. That's where we're going to try to figure that out right now, is try to get the keyboard mappings down. So here comes the interesting part. We've got all these game options loaded up, but the keys are not the things that we care about. It's the values, because the values are going to map to the key events. So I need to basically pull out all the properties that are related to the keyboard and put them somewhere that I can now sort of look at them. Now, I'm taking in all the properties here, and I don't care about all the properties. And so I'm kind of torn here. Do I leave all the properties here, or do I pull them out? And I'm kind of thinking that I need to sort of pull them out. So what I've written here is probably not exactly what I want. what I probably want to do is let's try, we'll say private, what data structure would be appropriate for this? Go back and forth in my head. It could be a list. It could be just a map. A map would be the most straightforward mapping. But I don't necessarily care about the keys anymore. Like in the properties file and the settings file, I don't really care about the keys at this point. I care about the values. Well, I take that back. I do care about the keys because the keys are going to tell me theoretically what they should map to. Theoretically. Well, is that true? No, that's not true. That's not, yeah, that's not true at all, actually. I mean, well, yeah, it is actually, because the way I have the settings here, I've got elevation down, mute toggle, special 1 left, special 2. These actually do correspond with my input operations. So I could say that that is how I'm mapping it, is by having these exactly that way, which would make sense because it means the mappings are now kind of intrinsic. It does kind of tie my hands a little bit because then I gotta make sure that whenever I add a keyboard thing that it has an input operation, but that might not be a terrible thing. Even with the mouse and the joystick, that might not be a terrible thing, that every input has some sort of input operation, some sort of operation in the input operations enum. So we'll go with that right now. It does make it more difficult later on if I were to refactor things. But right now it does make the code a little bit slightly cleaner, maybe, possibly cleaner. So what we'll do is we'll say private map string, right? String. I could actually do the mapping here, couldn't I? Key events. Yeah. And I could actually do, yeah, I could do this. Input operation, operations. It's not giving me the code complete because it doesn't know about map yet. So that's one of the that's an idiosyncrasy of Eclipse more than anything else. What do I want to call this? I want to call this init bindings. I think, yeah. Init bindings, yeah, because we know this is keyboard, so we know we're initting the keyboard bindings. And I will take in properties, game options. Ooh, spell it right. There you go. All right. Let's get map import it. Let's get import operations import it. And there we go. Okay. Now it's just complaining that I don't have a return value, which is correct. So I want to grab all the properties that begin with the word keyboard. Now under the covers, the properties is a hash table, so I should be able to get all the property. There is an enumeration, I believe, that encompasses all the property names. So I think it's game options, options dot, and I believe, so there's elements, which is enumeration of the values of the hash table. Might be what I want. Entry set. is the set of keys and values, and then there is keys, which is probably, well, there's key set, which is probably closer to what I want. I wonder with keys, in terms of enumeration of the keys in this hash table, that's in dictionary. Okay. Yeah, key set is probably closer to what I want because key set will have an iterator over it. Set is iterable, I believe. So, in fact, I know it's iterable. So, let me make sure there's nothing else that's like property names. In terms of enumeration of all the keys in this property list, including distinct keys in the default property list, the key of the same name has not already been found from the main properties list. Yeah. I don't know if I need all of that. I think having string property names. What? Where key and its corresponding value are strings, including distinct keys in the default. That's a weird one. Okay, I don't know why that's there, but let's do key set because I can at least work with that. So this will get me all the keys, and I want all the keys that start with keyboard, but we're going to end up iterating over everything, but that's fine. So what I'm going to do is for, and I'm going to say set string key in game options key set. This is the for each loop, which is something new for Java 5. We're in Java 8, so it's not really that new anymore. And actually Java's up to like 13 now, so it's definitely not new anymore. Key set, is that not objects? Change type of key to object. Oh, okay, it's bringing me back objects. All right, that's fine. Key. I'm surprised that brings me back an object. Oh, it's bringing me. Never mind. It's not bringing me back a set. It's bringing back. Let's try string. No, object key. Okay, okay, object key it is. That's fine because we know it's going to be a string. At the end of the day, I'm really surprised that that's bringing back objects though. Yeah, that's weird. Anywho, I guess that's why they gave me other things, right? Like the property names thing. That probably brings back strings, right? What does that? Let me see. Game options. Options dot elements. See, I don't want an enumeration back because that's not the right kind of enumeration. I could also do the for each, like I'm doing old school for each here, but you can do like the lambdas and stuff now where you do a for each on it. And in all honesty, I don't use that many lambdas in my normal coding. And I know that will drive a lot of people insane. But I don't particularly like how lambdas. It's a rare thing indeed that a lambda actually makes code easier to read. You know, sometimes it's abused a little too much. So I tend to avoid it, even though I know that causes physical pain to a lot of people. But it's just I'm used to doing it this way. I can type this faster, believe it or not, than I can a lambda, and this is just the way it is right now. So I want to then, let's try, what do I want? We got the keys coming back, so I want to do string key name equals key.toString. We'll just call toString on it and hope that everything is a string. It should all be a string. Actually, I could do string.valueOf, right? Which is probably a better thing. Yeah, let's do value of key there. So now I know I've got a string or the equivalent thereof. And then we'll say, what do I want to do? I want to see if it starts with if key name that starts with keyboard, and actually I should make that a constant, so private static final string keyboard bindings prefix, like that. Bam. And then just put that in here like so. So if it starts with that, then I want to put it into a map. So let's go make ourselves a map here of input operations key event events equals new. It can just be a hash map. So I don't know why it filled that out like that. Usually it's smart enough to just give me that. Okay, and we want to, so if it starts with that, the thing is, I'm going to want to do a get name so I get the correct input operation. I'm going to need it for the second half of that. So it's really from the dot onwards. So if I do is a little bit funkier than probably it needs to be. But if I say string, do I want to do string array? Yeah, I do. String array of, let's see, key name parts equals key name dot split on that's a regex, isn't it? So we got to do backslash dot backslash dot. Yeah, right, because it takes a regex. Yes. I wonder if there's a is there a method that takes a, no, it's all regexes. Okay, so I'll explain that. Because this is because the split takes a regular expression, period means any, in a regular expression nomenclature, period means any, or I should say one, any character is what it means. It means match anything. So I have to escape it so that the regular expression knows that this is not, it should not interpret the dot. In order to escape it, I got to do a backslash, but I can't just do one backslash. I got to do two because I gotta escape the escape so that it makes it in there. String has to be escaped so that it then goes through to the regex as a backslash dot, which means it's escape for the regex. But backslash means other things. It means escape, an escape in the string nomenclature. So by backslashing the backslash, I say ignore the escape and just pass it through as is. It's annoying. At the end of the day, it's annoying. But this is why you have to kind of do double backslash instead of just one for it, because you got to escape it because it's a string constant. And that's just the way things are. So with that, so our key name starts with keyboard. We know that there's only going to be one dot in there, hopefully, with the keyboard bindings. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So then that means the second item in the string, which would be string 1, will be the input operation that we want to do. And so I want to say input operations operation equals input operations dot name dot I think I gotta do new input no, I can't do that. Input operations dot get name. Value of, I guess it's value of, I think. Yeah, because that returns an input operation. So I think it's value of. And then it would be key name parts 1, because we want the second item in there. I believe that's correct. I believe that's correct. Because value of, I think it's taking a string, so I think value of is actually looking at the enumeration name. And then I need the value to be the actual value. So I need a key event. So key event operation value equals key event dot value of key event dot. Oh, is it not really enumeration? Wait a minute. Wait. Is it key event? Or no, I'm sorry. It's key code. Did I put key event? I meant key code. Yes, that's what I want. Key code. I screwed up. It should be key code here. Key code. Dot value yeah, because that's got add, accept, alt, asterisk, yeah, value of and then it's what am I looking at? Game options dot get property, and it'll be just key. That doesn't work. Key name. Let's try that. Right? Because get property takes a string, I believe. Yeah. Okay. So key name. That'll get me the value as a key code, which then means I can add this to the events.put. I don't know why it keeps doing compute. I keep saying .p and it keeps giving me a compute in there. I don't know why. It's matching the p in compute somehow instead of the p in put, which is really annoying because these all have that in there. I don't know why it's doing that. That's something in Eclipse. Something in Eclipse has changed to make this really freaking annoying now. So we want to put in there the operation and the operation value. Bam. That goes in there. And then we loop around again and we look at the next key name, and if it starts with the keyboard bindings prefix, then we do the whole thing over again. That should get us all the keyboard bindings. into a format that makes it really super easy for us to know what was just pressed. So, or know that what was just pressed is something that we care about based on the current bindings that the user has set. So then I just do a return events, hopefully. And if we don't find anything bound to anything, then it'll just be empty and our keyboard event handler won't handle anything. It'll handle the keys coming in, but it won't do anything with them. Which means I don't need game options here as a thing. I need map, input, operations, key code, and we'll call it key binding. Key bindings equals. I'll do a new hash map on here just so I don't have to deal with nulls. Basically, I'm defaulting it to an empty map because I'd rather default it to an empty map than have to deal with saying, is this null and is it an empty map? I can just say, I always know it's never going to be null, and I can just handle it and say, oh, is it an empty map or not? If I ever have to do a conditionals on it, which I probably will. Which means then this doesn't become that. That goes away. We call instead key bindings equals init. Actually, yeah. Actually don't need to do a new hash map here. I could just set it to null because init bindings will always bring back an empty map. So you know what? Let's just do that. Oh. We don't have to think about it at all. So that should be a thing. So then we pass in the game options, the whole property set, because we have it and it's easy. And then I just pull out of the property set the bindings that I care about. Now, the problem with this, and this is where I've now thought about something else I didn't think about initially. By putting this in the constructor, I now tell everybody that they need to have their bindings set. But it also means that if the user goes in and changes their bindings, I need to toss out the keyboard input handler and reinitialize it. And that's that's actually not desirable, right? Because we want the bindings to take effect immediately as soon as they save. So I got two options here. I can either keep this constructor, or I can get rid of or I can keep the constructor and add a setter. It's kind of frowned upon by most people. Or I just get rid of the constructor, and you just have to know when you do this that you have to set the bindings. I'm kind of leaning towards a combination of both, even though most people would balk at that, at having both a setter and having this here, having a constructor that does the same thing. So I'm going to kind of disguise it a little bit instead of saying it's a setter, because it's not really a direct setter. It's going to be more of a load new bindings kind of thing. In fact, I'm going to call it that even. I'm going to say public void load new bindings. I want to do that. See, I'm now debating. We're implementing event handler, but I kind of feel like I should also have a second implementation here. because I feel like the mouse input event should also do this. So what I'm thinking, I'm rethinking the way I have this set up, because we have to bring in the mouse as well to this, and the mouse is going to handle pretty much the same way that this is handling, right? The mouse input handler has to have a similar contract to the keyboard input handler if we want this kind of thing to not fall apart in the long run. So now I'm thinking maybe we need another interface here. So under input, I'm thinking I want to do I want it under input or I want it under bindings? Where are we at now? We're at keyboard, input event, input bindings. This feels like something that needs to be under the bindings. Input operations. Honestly, the input event might not be in its proper place either, but I feel like this needs to be under bindings. Let's do new. No, does it? No, I'm rethinking that. Let's do it under here, under input. Let's do an interface. I'm going to call it input handler. Okay. And we're going to extend yes, we're going to extend event handler. Nope, that's the wrong one. I don't want Corba. I want event handler JavaFX event. Event handler T. Yes, is what I want. And this is going to have to be a input handler T. Finish that. Although these are going to have to be T extends event, the type input handler. Yeah, I think this is T extends event, which is a JavaFX event. Yes, so now they're compatible. Okay. An input handler. This is how you do a generic, by the way. This is how you declare generic interfaces. In here, I want to put the bindings to load. So I'm going to say void load, and we're going to say properties game options there. There's no visibility or stuff on this because interfaces, this is a public interface, so it's going to be public. You don't have to, you don't have to put public there because it's defaults to public because it's an interface. And because it's an interface, we don't have an actual implementation here. All we're really doing is saying this is the contract that anything that implements this interface has to adhere to. And in this case, and you're probably saying, well, why have your interface, your input handler, implement the event handler interface? Because you can implement multiple interfaces, so there's no, why have them both do it? Really, it's just for convenience more than anything else. It's just so that I can just say change this from event handler to input handler key event, and in here, so then let's get rid of this. Now you see now I'm doing input handler, which it figured out is in this package. It's now telling me that I have unimplemented methods, namely load properties. I'm going to say add unimplemented methods, which put it down here, properties game options. Because of that, I'm going to remove the constructor begrudgingly. Begrudgingly, I'm going to remove the constructor, and instead I'm going to say down here, I'm going to actually move this private down as well. I don't like to have the private methods up at the top. It's just a preference thing. It's not a standards thing. It's a preference thing. Just a personal preference. And I'm going to say init bindings game options. And I'm going to, that brings back the map. So I'm going to set this dot key bindings equal to that. I actually don't need to do this. I'll just have it that way so we know. And then we just have to load these. We just have to know to load this whenever I create a keyboard input event. The idea here is that when I first map the keyboard input event, I only have to do it once. And then from that point forward, if anybody changes the bindings at any point later on, we just do another load in here, just call load on it, and those bindings will take effect immediately upon that load being called. And I don't have to re-register the input event handler with JavaFX. It'll still be registered and all is well with the world at that point. It's just that I have to remember when we do this that I need to load up the actual properties in there. You know, there is a method to saying, okay, you have a load method and you also have a constructor, and the constructor takes it. That way you're forcing people to load the stuff. You know, it's really comes down to what the team that you're working on prefers. I kind of see both ways. I kind of don't have a problem with having both. You don't often see both. Often you'll just see a load and then people just have to know that you'll see it this way, and people just have to know to call it. Usually that's because if you're doing dependency injection and stuff, you really don't want to have both methods, because dependency injection really, like frameworks like Spring, really want you to either do constructor injection or property injection and not both. So that's often why you'll see it this way. You'll see one or the other, but not both. We don't have that here, but there's nothing to say that we couldn't have like Spring Boot in here at some point in the future. So I kind of am like, yeah, the forcing people to do it when it's constructed maybe isn't as necessary as it sounds. It's just, you just got to remember to do it. Yeah, it is what it is. You know, the best case scenario, I could put a Java doc on here and just say, like, make sure you call this. You know, I mean, one way or the other, it's not going to work if you don't call it. I mean, it'll work, it'll register itself, but no keys will be processed. So you'll know one way or the other if you did it wrong. You'll know pretty quickly you did it wrong. So that's kind of how I justify it right now. So that said, that was probably the hardest part, right? Was just kind of mapping these things together. And now you can kind of see the madness that was what I had by putting these things in here the way that I did. It's a little bit hacky. I'll accept anybody who looks at this going, that's kind of hacky. I'll accept that judgment. It is a bit of a hack. I mean, I'm abusing enums in a way that perhaps they're supposed to be abused and perhaps not. I am kind of being a little bit abusive with the way enums work by basically saying, oh, here's some strings, and now we're now building an enum out of that. This is also one of those. This can also be viewed as an anti-pattern, because basically in the settings file, I'm now saying if somebody comes in later on and adds a setting here under the keyboard dot whatever, and they don't have it, they don't follow the same pattern where it's capitalized and it's an input operation, all that stuff, things will just explode spectacularly. Well, they actually won't yeah, they kind of will explode. What does happen if the value doesn't actually exist? I don't even know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what value of does if the value you're looking at doesn't exist. Returns the enum constant in the name of the specified name. The string must match exactly an identifier used to declare an enum constant in this type. Otherwise, it will throw illegal argument exception. So if somebody were to put something in the settings file that doesn't exactly match the enum, so it's not capitalized, or it doesn't have an underscore where it needs to be, or it's a brand new one that doesn't exist in there, it will throw an illegal argument exception, which is a runtime exception. That's why it's not bugging me about catching it. I mean, yeah, that's kind of sucks. But at the same time, we're talking about settings that are relatively fixed in the game. So there is an argument either way that's like, yeah, you really, if you do add something and you don't put it everywhere, it should blow up in your face immediately. And in this case, it will blow up as soon as you go to load the game. So if you've just added something to the game, you'll know immediately, you'll get immediate feedback that you did it wrong, or you didn't do it, you didn't put it everywhere you needed to put it. So there's an argument to say that the game's not going to ship in that broken state because, you'll know immediately that it's broken. And if a user goes in and adds something, then they'll screw themselves. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know what I mean? So I can see both. I can see both arguments for it, and I can see an argument that says that this is really, hard to read and not, no bueno. But at the same time, I mean, this class has 42 lines of code in it. Basically, well, 42 lines in it, not necessarily lines of code. And when you look at it, it actually, kind of makes sense. Maybe it doesn't entirely make sense. You probably would have to kind of read this and kind of tilt your head to the side a little bit to see what's going on there. So I could see someone freaking out about this and be like, yeah, no, this is not, you shouldn't do it this way. And I could see others being like, okay, that's acceptable. So I don't know. I'm kind of on the mindset of this might not be that terrible. It's maybe not entirely readable, but then again, when you know that you've got properties coming in and you're looking for particular properties that start with this here, and you go and trace this back and you're like, oh, this is loading from a settings.properties. And oh, look, there's properties that start with keyboard. And these properties look weird because they're capitalized, whereas all the other ones are not. You're like, okay, I kind of see what's going on. So it's not like it would take you a very long time to figure out what's happening. It's just that you wouldn't be able to read this code immediately and go, oh, I see what they're doing. You know what I mean? It's more like, oh, okay, I got to kind of take a few minutes to kind of parse this. So I could see there being negatives to doing it this way as well. But I am abusing the fact that we have an enumeration in JavaFX called key code, and I'm using that to its fullest extent. And to be fair, that is one of the benefits to using enumerations. So you know, maybe I'm abusing it properly. Maybe I'm not. It really comes down to how individual people feel about that. Again, this is the art versus science thing here. And who's to say that these value ofs aren't slow as balls and, you know, very inefficient? But then again, we're talking about doing something once, maybe twice, depending on how many times they go in. We're doing something that isn't during gameplay. We're doing something that's in the options menu or when the game first loads up. So performance here, maybe not quite as big a deal, you know. So that's my justification for it. And to be honest with you, I didn't know it was going to shape up this way until I started to really dig into why because I did this settings thing. I did this about a week or two ago, so I couldn't even remember why I made them capitalized, and then I realized, oh, okay, this is probably what I was going for. Why is this giving me a warning? The value is not used. Oh, right, because I haven't fully finished yet. Okay. Anyway, so that said, we need to actually, you know, put two and two together here. So this is the handle method. This is what's actually we actually had to implement as part of the event handler that JavaFX requires us to have a handle method. And then here, JavaFX will pass us a key event. And then from that event, we need to figure out what happened. The key event, I believe, has the key code. So if I look at the old keyboard enum that we saw here, you can see it takes a key event in. From that, it calls get code, which gives us a key code. And then from there, we look at the key code enumerations to determine what has taken place. So in this case, now I did mention that we do have to bring the state, the game state into view at some point to figure out exactly what's going on and whether or not certain keys are correct for the current state that we're in. What I haven't quite figured out is where exactly we need to worry about that. Like who needs to know that this is happening. There's also a key released as well. So I have to figure out whether or not, based on the key event, I guess I got to figure out, well, we got to figure out whether it's released or not. I'm not too concerned on that. Some of these are not really, like, I'm not sure. Well, some of these are based on, like, released is really what you want for menus and stuff. You want to look on key released, not on key pressed per se, because you don't want it to constantly open and close your menus and stuff. So I'm not. We'll see what I can do with that. This is on key press, and I think these both take just events. Yeah, key event and key event, and I imagine is passed to. I might be able to get from the event whether it's a key press or not. Let's see here. Event dot. What do we have on here? Get source. No, get target, event target, is control, is meta, is shortcut down, is consumed. What is consumed? Has been consumed by any filter or handler. Okay. So, oh yeah, here we go. Key pressed, key released, key typed. So pressed and released is where we would get this from the event type. Is there, so that's event type. event. Is there a get type here? Otherwise, yeah, get event type. Yeah, okay. So that's how we would determine whether or not it was a key press or a key release, which is going to be important also with the status of things. So our input operations, we have here up, down, left, right, pass, bonus, handbrake, all these, not zoom in, zoom out. Yeah. These are sort of the raw operations that you can do. This is not really the input event. Well, this is not really the mapping. This is kind of the internal mapping that we would refer to things as, but this is not necessarily whether or not the input is valid based on the current state of the system. And this is where I may have put a additional layer of abstraction here that isn't necessary. By having this input operations thing here, honestly, it would probably be better off if well, this is kind of necessary because since you can rebind the keys to anything, you kind of need this input operations here to tell you internally what was pressed, not what mechanism the pressing happened through, if that makes any sense. So I kind of need this, but at the same time, I need like another abstraction layer on top of it that says, here's the actual operation we need to do. Well, operation is the wrong word, but here's the actual function, I guess. Here's the actual game function that happened. And now I'm kind of using a lot of adjectives that aren't going to be very easy to kind of differentiate. So input operations probably is the wrong word for this. This is more like input mapping. So I think what I'm going to do right now is change this, because this is going to cause me no end to confusion. And again, this is something I came up with, so this is like pass 2, right? This is like draft 2, where like you get to a point where you're like, oh, this was a bad way to name this, and I'm at that point now. So even I'm not immune to naming things wrong. So let's do a refactor on this. Let's rename it from input operations to input. Okay, so after hemming and hawing some more on it, I decided that I was going to update the enumeration for input mapping to take in whether or not this action requires a held button versus a not held button. A button press versus a button hold. Which actually kind of does apply across input devices. You know, whether you hold a button down versus you just press and release a button. So it's kind of, I guess this kind of makes sense here. It doesn't necessarily make sense with all the mappings, kind of like the way I have them listed out here, but for mappings where it doesn't make any sense, like for instance the select, I can just default it to false because you're not really holding down the select button, but it doesn't really matter whether you do or not. So you know, you're selecting in the menu and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter if you're holding the button down or not, kind of. So I'm just going to kind of leave it. And some of these are might be a little bit too might have to be tweaked, like the volume up and volume down. Like I can see that being one or the other. Like I can see that being like you can hold it down, but as long as the repeat on it isn't too bad, it wouldn't be so bad. And brightness up and brightness down, I can see you can holding that button down, but it depends on how often you repeat that action as to whether or not it's going too fast or too slow for the user. I reserve the right to change my mind on this as we get deeper into it. But what I wanted to do was I didn't want to put something in the input mapper that wasn't generic, and at the same time, when I think about it, it is kind of generic as to whether or not you're holding a button down versus not holding a button down. That's something that can apply across input devices. So I don't think it's that terrible putting it there. And also it kind of keeps this relatively, it kind of cleans this up a little bit, and I don't have to kind of pollute my input handler, my input event handler, with that stuff, which is never really going to change. I mean, it'll change during development, but it won't ever change dynamically by the user or anything like that. So I think this works out better. So that said, now that I have that, I need to integrate that with this stuff. And so we have a key event coming in. We need to handle where or what has been pressed. So what I want to do here on the keyboard input event is have a, I guess I have to put a key or I guess an input handled. I have to put a way to get whatever the last input was that came in, and this is where having this input handler interface is probably where it should go. So in here we have a load for the actual bindings, but I need a way to get the event out of there, the input event, I guess. So I'll say, and that'll just be the default there, and then we'll just say down here we'll say return input. Whoop. All right, and then I just have to set it here in the handler. I gotta make sure I set it appropriately if it is supposed to be set based on the event that came in. So we'll have to say, is this something in our bindings? So if key bindings, although I have it reversed, don't I? Yeah, you know what? I just realized I've reversed what I want here. So I want input mapping to be the value, and I want key code to be the key, because it just makes life easier if the key code's the key. So we'll do this way, right? Which means I got to reverse this as well. Let's do that. Do that. Right. And yeah, I should be able to reverse this easily, I would say. Key code, input mapping. And then it's just operation value operation. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's better that way, because then what I can do then is just say contains key. I mean, yeah, it doesn't really matter. There is a contains value, but this just, people are going to expect the key to be the more important thing. So I'm just going to say contains key. And I want event dot get code, right? So just make sure it actually contains that key. And I guess I could do this as a compound if, because it makes sense to do it that way. And if that's true, because it'll short circuit if it's not true. If that's true, and the what could I do that though? Code. No, we gotta do it. For readability's sake, I'll have to do it in here. So I'll do if it contains the key, then I'll say it'll be input mapping key mapping equals key bindings dot get, and then it's event dot get code, right? If key mapping dot get held action yes, if the get held action is true, and event instance of what is it? Key event dot instance of event dot so if it's a held action, then it has to be a key pressed. If it's not a held action, then it's a key released. So key pressed. Did I do that right? Event instance of am I not doing this right? Because event is a key event, right? That's not. I'm not doing that right. I think it's event get event type. Equals event key pressed. Am I doing that right? I think that's correct. Key pressed. Be accessed in a static way, right? Key event key pressed. Okay. Yeah, I think that's correct. Okay. So if the held action is true, then it's going to be a key pressed event that we care about. So if this is true and the key event that came in is for key press, then we'll set, and only then we'll set the input equal to the key mapping. All right. Else if key else, well, right, we still have to do a compound else. We have to do an else if, because the else is not going to be correct for this. So key mapping dot get held action. We'll say else if not key mapping dot get held action, which means it's false. And event dot get event type equals key event dot key released. Then the input equals the key mapping. Otherwise, we'll just do an else. Input equals null. Should I do null? Yeah, we'll do null as the thing. I could always put an input mapping as invalid if we really need to get that pedantic. But right now, I'll just set it to null. And we'll just deal with null in that case. So then that should do it then, right? Because then we're saying these input keys that are held or pressed. So this input mapping will always be a valid input mapping unless if we got the valid mapping, if the mapping was valid based on the key press or release, then it'll be a valid input mapping. Otherwise, it'll be null, is what we're saying here. So I think that handles that, and I think we've got it fleshed out now to where this might be a thing. Now, at this point, I would write a unit test. Actually, honestly, there is a school of thought that says do test-driven development, where I would already have the test written. My brain doesn't work that way. That's why I write tests second. But in order to write the test for this, I'm going to need to have some mock objects, which is going to involve bringing down probably the JMock library and stuff like that. So that's going to take some doing, and we've already gone pretty long as it is. So I'm probably going to do the actual test for this and show you how I'm going to do the test for this in the next episode, which will be a brand new day for me because I've been going on for quite a while here, several hours. So I'm going to, and I have to figure out the logistics of it because I'm pretty sure I can use JMock to mock out the interfaces that I need. But I gotta kind of work on it a little bit because it's been a little while since I've done JMock, not a huge amount of time, but I also need to make sure that I can actually successfully mock things out in a fat app and all that stuff. So I might have to use a different mocking tool for that because JMock I usually use for web apps, but it should work in theory for fat apps like this. So we'll see how it works and how I can do it, and then we'll have that as a separate episode because it will be an episode unto itself because I'll have to do sort of the setup for the framework and explaining how mocks work and all that stuff. And this is a good point where I actually need it because in order to do an integration test with this keyboard event handler, I would have to actually I'd have to actually have something that compiles. I'd have to spin up the JavaFX framework, and I'd have to actually integrate this, and then I'd have to have a window that you can actually type into and do all that stuff. And that's a lot. That's further down the line than I'm actually at right now. And at some point we will have integration tests for it, but right now I would want to do this is a good case for having a unit test, an actual physical test that exists outside of an actual otherwise compiling framework and compiling application, basically. So that's where we stand on that. So as an end to this this episode here, I will do a commit to my local, and I've got a lot of changes across here, and this is where I kind of look through and see what changes I've made. This whole thing is brand new, so that's why that's showing up like that. How do I close this? Oh, here, it's up here. Options loader test. A lot of these are brand new things. Technically speaking, I can delete the keyboard class now because it's not really of use to me. However, I'm going to need to keep it around so that I know where everything was coming into play. Technically speaking, I should be able to look at the history of this, but because I'm actually removing it entirely, it becomes difficult to actually see the history of this class because it's actually going to be removed from the list, and you'd have to kind of dig through some things in order to see the history of it. And this is true for any real code integration stuff. So what I'm going to do instead, just to make my life easy, is I'm just going to comment out the keyboard class altogether so that we don't get the compilation errors on it, and I can still see it. So I'm going to do this the easy way. I'm going to do select all, and I'm going to do Control-Shift-C, which in Eclipse does a single line comment for the whole thing. There's actually a multi-line comment, isn't there? Which actually is probably better off. Let's do Control-A, Control-Shift-C. I think it's source surround with. No, there's a command to do it. Oh, here it is. Block comment. Control-Shift/. Or that's remove block comment. Add block comment is Control-Shift/. Okay, so Control-Shift/. Bang. So that really made it ugly, didn't it? Wow, it really did. Okay, let's undo that. Let's do single line comments then, because I want to still be able to read the thing. So I save now. Yeah, I still want it to be readable. So that multi-line block actually made it unreadable, which I was not expecting. Okay. Anyway, so that's why I'm just going to comment this out so that we know that we're finished it, but at the same time, I'm going to need to be able to reference back to this easily. And if I delete it, it's still going to be in the source control locally, but it's going to be hard to find. I'm going to have to go through a bunch of things to see it. So this is why I'm doing it this way, friends. So with that, I will say thank you so much for watching, everybody. And I hope that I haven't completely lost everyone with being so indecisive and rambly and all that stuff. But I feel like this is still helpful, to see someone going through all their thought processes and all that stuff. And we'll see how much I can mercifully edit everything down to make it a little bit more palatable, hopefully. Again, thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you hopefully next time.